Well, good evening and welcome to Christianity A&E Answers and Evidence. This is week 2, which is looking at, if the slide works for me, the problem of evil and suffering. So, last week we were looking at the question of where does everything come from, looking at scientific evidence, evidence which we find in the universe, which everyone, no matter your worldview, atheist, agnostic, Christian, whatever, everyone has to explain this evidence. And we were looking at the evidence and asking what is the best explanation. And what we were doing was looking at the evidence from inside the room or outside the room. This is a technique used by detectives. So, for example, if they go into a room and they find a dead body, is it a murder? One way they discover this is they look at the evidence and see, can this evidence be described, be explained by staying within the confines of the room, in which case it's probably a suicide or natural death, or do they need to go outside the room to explain the evidence, in which case that adds a sense of urgency to the case. So we're looking at the universe in the same way. There's different types of evidence. Like I say, if you go to a crime scene and you find bits of evidence which you can't explain by staying in the room, you know there's a perpetrator, there's someone outside the room, there's an external force. So last week we were looking at bits of evidence. So we looked at the evidence that the universe had a beginning. The universe appears to be fine-tuned. Life originated from non-life, and biological organisms display attributes of design. We looked at all this evidence and we asked, well, can we explain that by staying within the natural realms of the universe, or is the best explanation something outside the universe? And what we came across was this emerging suspect profile for the cause of the universe. We saw that it has to be external to the universe. Non-spatial, atemporal, non-material, it has to be uncaused, powerful enough to create everything we see in the universe, specifically purposeful enough to produce a universe fine-tuned specifically for life, intelligent and creative and resourceful. Dr. Arno Panzais said, "The best data we have concerning the origin of the universe are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole." So tonight we're going to be looking at the problem of evil and suffering. And disclaimer, who here has either experienced suffering, knows someone who's experienced suffering, or has heard of an act of evil? See, last week I was talking about evidence like the strength of gravity, the fact that DNA holds information. Very few of us have no emotional connections to these facts. But when we're talking about suffering, every single one of us does have personal experience of that, and it is something which is very emotional. If someone came to me and they said that they were going through a time of suffering, the first thing I would do wouldn't be show them this slideshow. The church can help with a lot of suffering. If someone comes with a variety of different suffering, the church has amazing people who can be really supportive, and as well it's got connections to lots of organisations which can help with different suffering. What we're going to be doing tonight, though, is looking at the question of where does evil come from. I hope it is going to give everyone here a lot of hope. I do hope it's going to give you encouragement. But if it's going to give you encouragement for a specific trial you're going through, I'm not so sure, and I don't think it's designed to do that. Also, the question of why would God allow evil is perhaps the biggest question. When I was researching, I came across this course, which is coming up in September if anyone wants to apply. It is a 6-week course, specifically about the question of evil and suffering. I've got an hour and a half, so I'm that good. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but what I hope I'm going to do is, like last week, everything which I touched on was just the tip of the iceberg. I hope we're just going to open the door and show you what type of evidence there is. So, first bit of evidence. Consciousness exists in the universe. Here's a question. Where does modern science come from? Modern science originates from the 17th century. There were scientific discoveries before then, obviously. The Chinese invented a lot of things, including gunpowder. The ancient Greeks were great philosophers. However, the Chinese were very practical in their science. The Greeks were very philosophical. They were armchair scientists. The Greeks, for example, thought that the Earth went around the sun in a perfect circle because that made the most logical sense. Everything had to make logical sense. They never bothered to check. The 17th century, it was actually Christians who developed the modern scientific technique. Christians who thought that the universe is designed by mind, that we are made in the image of that creator, we have a mind like that creator, therefore we should be able to understand the working of the universe. And by studying nature, you were studying God. And it was from them that the modern scientific technique came about. But here's a question. Is your brain the same as your mind? Who thinks brain and the mind are the same? Who here's not sure? Got a few more there. Well, there's a lot of people who say that there is no difference. However, if you look at it, there are quite a few differences. So, for example, the brain is public, but the mind is private. What do we mean by that? You have sometimes studies where people say, by scanning the brain, we know what the person was thinking. They only know what the person was thinking because the person who was thinking it told them what they were thinking at the time. And they just scanned his brain, or her brain at the time, and it's like, what were you thinking about? I was thinking about this. We know what they were thinking about. It's this. Your mind is something which is private. Inness and aboutness. What do we mean by this? Imagine you're lying in your bed, and you hear a noise outside your window. And you think to yourself, I think there's a burglar. You are now imagining this burglar. And the more you think about it, the more you think about this burglar, the more ideas you have about the burglar. The burglar might not exist, but he exists in your mind. Here's a little example. If you were to close your eyes and imagine a woman very close to you, either like, mother, sister, friend, they're standing in the kitchen and they're wearing a dress which you've never seen them in before, and it's a colour which they wouldn't normally wear. Can you see that dress in your mind's eye? Where does that dress exist? If materialism's true, where does this idea of the dress come from? But if we have a mind, then that's where it exists. It exists in our mind. So the brain can be incorrect. You can sometimes see something and it's like a mirage. You get the wrong idea about it. But if someone asks you what you feel about it, or what you thought, or what pictures came into your head, that's indisputable. That is what you thought. That's a difference. Your brain is impersonal, whereas your mind is personal. Your brain is just like, a collection, it's gathering data, but the mind has personal feelings. Your mind can recollect memories and has emotional connections to it. Your brain can pick up sound waves, which we call music, but your personal response to that, your emotional response, is something different. The mind is measurable. The brain is measurable. We can take the brain, put it on some scales, we know how much it weighs. How much does the mind weigh? How big is the mind? You can take a brain, you can measure it, but are there any limits to the mind, to your imagination? Again, it's another difference. So, does the brain equal the mind? I don't think it does. So where does this idea, or where does the mind come from? Because we see here, we've got all these examples which show that the mind is different than the brain. It is something immaterial. So where does this come from? Can we explain this by staying within the confines of the realm of the universe? Well, is it merely behavior? No. Causes of behavior are different than behaviors. Not all mental states result in behaviors. You can be mistaken about mental states. Is it merely functional states? No. Functionality doesn't always result in mental states and can't explain individual mental experiences. Is it merely brain states? Though many differences between the mind show that can't be true. Does the mind not exist? Well, that ignores all the evidence. This is something which we have personal experience of. We all experience the mind. However, there are some scientists who say, no, it's just a brain, no different. John Lennox, the famous Oxford professor, someone said to him, why are you a Christian? And he said, because science points me that way. And they said, well, how can you believe that? And he says, what do you do science with? And he tapped his head to give him a hint. And they said, we do it with your brain. Brain, it's done with the brain. And he goes, okay, well, where does the brain come from? Tell me about the brain. I said, oh, that's easy. The brain is the result of random mutations over a period of time. It's just like roll of the dice. It's just a bunch of chance. Over time, it's developed. And he says, okay, what do you do your lab work with? That we do it with our computer. He says, if I brought in a computer, which I'd got from a junkyard, which I said, this has developed over time, different bits of materials have just come together, gathered into this, here's your computer. Would you trust it? And they were like, well, no, I wouldn't trust that. I was like, well, but you would trust your brain, which came about by the random things themselves. If you get rid of the mind, you get rid of truth, because suddenly your mind, like truth is not the aim. The brain is just random collection of chance. Where does truth come from? Where does logic come from? If it's just all materialistic, if it's just all chemicals and random mutations, you've completely destroyed it. A bit of evidence we have is that humans possess free agency. We have free will. Although this is disputed, for example, we have Sam Harris, who says, how can we be free, conscious agents severely attend caused by events in our brain that we do not intend and of which we are entirely unaware? We can't. Sam Harris says that basically our minds are just chemical dominoes. We don't have free will, we just respond to past events. We have Richard Dawkins, who says, DNA neither cares nor knows, DNA cares, and we dance to its music. We don't make any decisions. It's just DNA. It's just chemicals. Although both of these people wrote these ideas in books, which they decided to sell to people, to, one thinks, change their minds, which if there's no free will, they could have just made a chemical cocktail and given it to people if they wanted to change their mind, if it's just that. But so, are our decisions determined by prior causal events outside of our control? Is everything we do just a case of dominoes falling? Who decided to come here tonight? Did you decide to come here tonight? Or was it just some chemical events in your brain? Was it a fact that this morning you saw a red car which started the dominoes falling to you being here tonight? If the universe is purely materialistic All we are biological robots, just going along, and yet we experience free will and a sense of responsibility. These are experiences which we all have. We cannot account for free agency by redefining the order of our desires. Some people say, well, you just go after what you like. But there are times when I'm sure all of us have made a decision to do something which we wouldn't want to do. But we felt an obligation to do it. That's not going after your desires. We can't just say that free agency, well, it just emerged. Because that doesn't explain anything. It's like, where does free agency come from? It just is. If you saw, a huge crater in the ground, and where did this huge crater come from? And you said, well, it's just there. It doesn't explain anything. Also, we cannot trust our choices if our choices are indetermined. Last week I asked the question, why are some of you Christian? Why do you believe what you believe? Well, you have no choice in the matter. If you're a Christian because you have to be. If you're an atheist because you have to be under this. You didn't make any decisions. Can't explain free agency by denying its existence. There was a case in America where the police were looking at this guy. He was a known drug addict. He'd committed some robberies. They were following him to see if he was going to commit another crime. He jumped over the fence and he went outside a house. And he sat down outside this house. And the police were watching him and he was just sat there for 25 minutes, not doing anything. After 25 minutes, he got up, kicked the door in, started to rob the place. Police arrested him. Now, at his trial, they said, what were you doing? Sat outside. And he says, well, I was deciding whether or not to give up drugs. I didn't like where my life was. And I was thinking, should I rob this house or should I not? I was trying to decide what to do. And then he said, but I can't be found guilty because I wasn't responsible. I was coming off a drug high. I'd taken some drugs that morning. I was coming down, so I wasn't thinking clearly. The chemicals in my bloodstream made me do it. The judge said, it doesn't matter what state you're in. You made the decision. Even with drug system, you made a decision. You made a decision to take those drugs. You made a decision to go to that house. You made a decision to then rob the house. The state of the man's mind and what chemicals he had in his bloodstream made no difference. So if we have no free will, then the whole system of law, why do we have prisons? Why do we have facilities where we try and change people, where we punish people who are guilty, if they had no free will? So how do we explain free will? Again, we've seen that it can't be explained by being redefined. We can't say it simply emerged. We can't say it's an illusion. But we can explain it if, again, we go outside the room. If we say that we have conscious minds because there is a conscious mind, and that we have free will because the mind which created has free will. That's an explanation. Another piece of evidence is transcendent objective moral truths exist. This is denied by Friedrich Nietzsche, who says there are altogether no moral facts. Does anyone know the difference between objective and subjective? Yes? Yeah? Perfect answer. That is absolutely correct. As I said, objective is something like, my car is white. That's an objective fact. White cars are the best cars is a subjective fact. It's a fact because that's my personal opinion, but isn't it an objective fact? No, it's not. So the question becomes, are moral laws objective or subjective? There's a case in America, in LA, of a man called Jesse who belonged to a gang. He was arrested because he'd killed a rival member of another gang. When the police brought him in, they said, why did you kill this man? And he said, that guy from this other gang was dating my sister. And they said, well, why did you kill him? Well, there's a law between our two gangs. You do not date people from the other gangs. So they talked to the members of Jesse's gang, and they all said, Jesse was 100% right to kill the guy. You know, the guy was dating his sister. What else was he going to do? They spoke to the gang of the victim, and they said Jesse was 100% right to kill him. He should not have been dating the member of another gang. However, the law of California disagreed. Jesse went to prison, but it raises the question, how high do moral laws go? So here we've got Jesse's personal beliefs. He believed he should have committed the crime. Jesse's gang, they agreed. But that was different than the Los Angeles Code. State of California. But let's say the state of California disagreed with United States Federal. Well, then you'd go to United States Federal. But what if United States passed a law which the United Nations decreed wasn't right? How far up do moral laws go? Because there's some people who say, well, it is all subjective. For example, stealing can be morally acceptable. If you're stealing to feed like a starving child, lying can be morally acceptable. During the Second World War, there were people who helped hide Jewish people from the Nazis. And if they were asked, do you have any Jewish people here? They are perfectly morally acceptable. No one? No one here? Even killing, in the right circumstances, there are times when we would say killing is morally justifiable. If someone is attacking someone and they're going to kill them, that might be a case where it is morally justifiable. This is where people will say, you see, it's a grey area, it's all subjective. However, if you say, like, stealing, lying, killing to protect one's life or protect an innocent person, you can say, okay, that's morally good. But is it ever morally justifiable to steal for the fun of it? Or to lie for the fun of it? Or to kill for the fun of it? If you add to the fun of it for anything, it's suddenly never morally acceptable. So where do moral obligations come from? See, I've got my box here. I have no moral obligation to the box. Because I've got no moral obligation to it. I can do what I like to the box. It's just an object. However, I can put Tony in the front row and tip him out of his seat. That happens later on, by the way. Watch out, Tony. Because I have a moral obligation. Tony is another individual. And like living things, we have moral obligations to living things. See, a policeman doesn't have any moral obligation to his vehicle, his flashlight, or the laws of physics. But a policeman would have moral obligations to people who he works with, people living in their town. And if there was a transcendent person, they would have a moral obligation to them. Without moral laws, and if it's all subjective, what's the difference? There is no difference. It's just opinion. Mother Teresa, Adolf Hitler, if there's no morals, just the same. No one did anything right, no one did anything wrong. They just did what they wanted to. It's fine. But we all know that's not the case. We all feel it. When we see an injustice, we feel an injustice. Where does that feeling come from? Well, maybe moral laws are just majority thinking. It's like the Brexit vote. Brexit is morally correct because more people voted for it. You cannot argue against it. Anyone who argues against Brexit is immoral. Does anyone believe that? Of course not. I mean, if it's a case of majority, well, a few years, 100 years ago, slavery was morally justifiable. In Roman times, gladiator matches, or human sacrifices in the past, completely morally justifiable because the majority of people wanted it. But in the trials of the Nazis, they used that argument. They said to the court, you cannot judge me because I was following the law of my country. My country said what I was doing was right. And the judge said, there is a higher morality to which you owe allegiance. There is a higher morality than just what the state says. So can we explain morals by, just it's in our DNA? Well, not really. Because, if it's random mutation designed for survival of the fittest, where does charity come into that? Where does helping someone else at the detriment of yourself come into that? Where does self-sacrifice come into that? Where do these come from? Bad news, we've been invaded by aliens. These aliens have come, they've got superior weaponry, they're geniuses, they're superior to us in every single way. They are killing millions of people as we speak. But it's fine, because they're a higher life form. Just the same way you step on an ant, doesn't matter. These aliens have come along, it's fine. We're ants to them, they're going to step on us. Would anyone accept that? If you watch a film and the aliens are attacking and you see cities being destroyed, do you think, good, we deserve it? Or do you think, oh no, that's awful, that's terrible, I hope we fight off those nasty aliens? Of course you do. But as Richard Dawkins says, much as we might wish to believe otherwise, universal love and the welfare of the species as a whole are concepts which simply do not make evolutionary sense. You can't explain this just by, evolution. So, where do these objective moral laws come from? Are they illusions? Well, no, it's something which we all experience. It's not an illusion. When we feel a sense of injustice, that's not an illusion. Is it just brute facts? Is it just the way it is? No, it doesn't have to be that way. And it doesn't explain anything saying it's that way. Are they purely subjective? Again, no, because there are moral laws which we can all agree on. Is it relative to different groups? Again, no. In that, it has to be something higher than that. Are the biological facts? Well, that assumes a moral definition of well-being. For example, Sam Harris, he says, well, good and evil, it's just what is good for you and what's bad for someone. He's not quite, he's nearly there. He's nearly at like a heaven and hell scenario, but he's not there. But if we go outside the room again, we can ground moral laws in a personal, transcendent moral being. If there is something which is outside the room, a standard by which everything is measured, then we can explain it. but we cannot explain it just by staying within the material world. Moral laws do not work in that confine. Another piece of evidence: evil and suffering persist. Richard Dawkins says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infantile, genocidal, words I can't pronounce, megalomaniac, capricious, malevolent bully." He doesn't mince his words. Christopher Hitchens says, "Religion is a totalitarian belief. It is a wish to be a slave. It is a desire that there be an unalterable, unchangeable, tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crimes while you are asleep, can subject you to total surveillance around the clock every waking and sleeping minute of your life before you're born, and even worse, and where the real fun begins, after you're dead, where you enter a celestial North Korea." The question of evil is the hardest question. We've been looking at all these evidences and saying where do they point, and we've been saying, well, look, it points to something outside the universe. But let's say you had a crime and you had a suspect and you had different evidence which all pointed to one suspect, and you're like, that's the guy. But then you found out he wasn't at the scene of the crime. He has an alibi. It can't be him. Then no matter how strong the other evidence is, he cannot be the person you're looking for. The same way, the question of evil points a lot of people away from God. They think that the fact that there is evil means that there cannot be a loving God. This is the number one objection. Behind me is a still from a film which you can watch on YouTube. It's called Kaylie's Love Story. When I was growing up, my sister had a best friend called Sandy. Sandy would come round every Friday, Saturday night, and her and my sister would go out to a club, or they would go out to the movies. Suddenly, Sandy started bringing her niece, Kaylie, when she was getting older, and they would go to movies together. So pretty much once a week, I'd see Kaylie. I saw her like when she was 10 years old. A few years ago, Sandy put a message on Facebook. "If anyone knows where Kaylie is, please let us know." The message then came through about half an hour later. "Please, if anyone knows where she is, please contact us urgently." 2 hours later, another Facebook post. It was a police contact for Kaylie. She disappeared on a Friday night. Her body was found on the Tuesday. She had been on Facebook where she'd been contacted by someone. That person asked her to come round and visit her house. She lied to her parents about where she was going. When she was there, she was given alcohol, and stuff which I cannot talk about happened to her, and she was eventually killed. The end of the film has something which isn't factual. The end of the film, you see her parents identify the body by the cloth being pulled away and them looking at her face. When her parents went to identify the body, the police showed them her hand, because it was the one part of her body which hadn't been severely mutilated. This is an act of pure evil. And I'm here standing before you saying there's a loving God. How do I justify it? Well, with any act of evil, there's a variety of things which come together for an act of evil to happen. So Kaylie, bless her, she had a very trusting personality. When she had a message come through from a guy who said he was interested in her, she trusted it. It was around a busy holiday. So when she said to her parents, "Can I go stay with a friend this weekend?" They were like, "Well, yeah." thinking, well, that's okay, gives us time to get stuff ready for the holidays. The person who committed a crime had a disturbing upbringing. He had access to a location where he could keep Kaylie. He had a perfect vehicle because no one saw him pick her up or go. And he had the opportune timing. If all of these things hadn't happened, Kaylie would still be alive. It's a very complex set of circumstances which came together. But like I say, an act like that, an act of pure evil, for a lot of people can say, well, there cannot be a God if something like that can happen to a 15-year-old girl. There are two types of evil, which aren't showing. There's moral evil and natural evil. So moral evil is the stuff which I talked about with Kaylie. Stuff which someone's made a moral decision to do something. That is something which we can, to some degree, get our heads around. But then there's also natural evil. If there's a tsunami or an earthquake or a pandemic or a young child who gets ill, how do we explain that? Well, there are different ways to look at evil. And like I say, this is where the view of evil, if you're going through a personal trouble, this might not at the time seem like a reasonable answer to you. But if we have an accurate view of eternity, that can help us understand evil. The proper idea of evil in relationship to free will. An appropriate definition of love can help understand evil. Role in character development. I mean, that might sound crazy, but how many of you here have gone through an experience which you never wanted to go through? Something which you found really hard, and then, sometime later, someone else was going through a similar experience, and they couldn't handle it. But you'd been through it, and then you could give them advice. Or vice versa. So you saw someone do something, you thought, how did they handle it? You go through a similar experience. It can be consequent. And also our limited understanding, which is quite hard to accept. I mean, how do you define evil? Let's say that you thought all there is this life. I'm going to live till I'm 90 years old. And what I want is I want to have a healthy life from when I'm born till I'm 90, then I can die. That's a good life. That's what I want. That's my expectation of life. When you're 40, you find out you've got cancer. Suddenly, that expectation has been cut drastically short. That's evil. But let's say life isn't just dot to dot. What if life isn't that, but life's like a laser? It starts there, but it goes on for eternity. Who here had an operation when they were young or ill as a child? At the time, if someone said to you, how would you describe life? At that precise moment, you'd be like, well, it's awful. What do you mean? How bad does it impact you now, all these years later? Is it as bad as at the time? Now, imagine just a span of a few years can alter your perspective of that time of suffering and evil. Imagine if you've got eternity. So suddenly, the suffering shrinks. Because if Christianity is true, then no one truly dies, we just change locations. But when you're looking at any act of evil, it's the relationship between these different things in explaining what happened is incredibly complex. Now, it's not something which you can just do on Twitter. You can't just say, okay, here's what explains this act of evil. You can't do it, which makes it incredibly hard. But if you want to live in a world which has these characteristics, and I think we can agree these characteristics are good characteristics: courage, compassion, forgiveness, self-sacrifice, charity. Who agrees those are good characteristics? Well, to have those, you have to have a world where there's danger, suffering, evil, hardship, and poverty. You cannot have one without the other. It's impossible by definition. Last week we looked at the evidence for God as a crime scene, and at the end I asked the question, what's the motive? If there is an external force to the universe, something which created the universe, why? What was the process there? The answer is love. The same motive a parent has when they want to have a child. They feel love, they want to share that love. Would a God create a universe with beings which have free will, minds like his? Love. The Bible talks about God from the very beginning as what we know in Christianity as the Trinity. There's multiple parts in this one God. There's the famous line, "Hear, O Israel, Lord your God is one." It translates as, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh thy Elohim is echad." Elohim is the plural for God. In Hebrew, El is God. Elohim is the plural, minimum of three. So hear, Israel, the Lord your minimum three gods are echad, which means group one, unified. See, you cannot have love singular. You have to have love. If you're going to love, you've got to have an object for love. So God, in this Trinity, has love in the Trinity, has an overflowing love. So we have a motive for why create a universe which is fine-tuned specifically for intelligent life. It's an act of love. But if you want to have love, you have to have free will. You cannot have love without free will. Could God create a world without suffering? Yes. Would it be a world where love could be possible? No. Because you have to have free will to have love. So, an act of evil. How do you define evil? Well, there's a skeptic's argument against God, which, again, it's the Euphoria dilemma. So it says, is something good because God loves it, or does God love something because it's good? Now this becomes a dilemma, because if something's good because God loves it, that means God's morals are subjective. But if God loves something because it's good, that means there's a moral standard beyond God. So what's the answer to this dilemma? The answer is, the standard of moral good is God's nature. God's nature is the standard by which we measure what is good. C.S. Lewis, he was a famous atheist who turned Christian, and he says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" Of course, could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it had not happened to please my fancies. Let's say you're watching football. Is it better for a striker to hit the ball into the back of a goal or to hit it into the crowd? What's better? Back of the goal? Yeah. They're on your team. How do you know it's better to get it in the back of the goal? Because the game has rules. And kicking it into the ground goes against those rules. So an act of evil is something which goes against the nature of God. There's a famous story of young Albert Einstein, where he was in class and his teacher says, if there is a God, God must be evil, because God created evil. And a young Einstein, is there such a thing as cold? Such a thing as cold. I can feel the cold. He goes, no, there's no cold. Cold. He says, is there such a thing as darkness? And he says, well, of course there's darkness. Every night it's dark. No, there's no such thing as darkness. Darkness is the lack of light. So with that thinking, if God's nature is the standard of good, evil is something which goes against that. But there are questions people ask about God, like little problems which people bring up, moral questions. These are questions which have filled many books and philosophers have argued about for centuries. So let's get them done in a few minutes. Why doesn't God stop all the evil in the world? Well, he might start with me. He might start with you. You know, when we ask that question, we never factor ourselves into the question, do we? It's like, well, why doesn't God stop that evil? He could stop your evil too. But it raises the question, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? If he's neither able nor willing, then why call him God? It's missing a point here about God, which we will get to. But it is a very important question. Next question. Does the Bible condone slavery? This is one which comes about, and people say, well, if you read the Bible, it talks about rules for when you own a slave and how to treat a slave. So the Bible definitely condones slavery. No, it doesn't. Slavery in the ancient world is different than our modern idea of slavery. Our modern idea of slavery comes from what happened in America. You know, those terrible events of the people being taken and forced to work land, whereas in the ancient world and in ancient Israel, if you owed a debt to someone, you would work for that person for a maximum of 7 years, at which point you could be let go, and there are rules of how to treat that person. If you mistreated that person was free from their obligations. That's very different than our modern idea of slavery. But even more surprising is this. This is the Holy Bible selected for the slaves. This is what slave owners would give to their slaves. Who here has seen this before? Not surprising. But what is surprising about this Bible is it includes only 10% of the Old Testament. Half the New Testament is gone. And among the excluded passages are Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, you are all one in Christ Jesus. Slave owners gave their slaves Bibles, but they heavily edited it. Not surprising, the entire book of Exodus is gone. If you want to know what God thinks about the modern idea of slavery, Exodus. But William Wilberforce, Christian, he stood up against slavery. Why? Because he was a Christian. Because he read his Bible and he saw that it spoke against it. He says, private faith that does not act in the face of oppression is no faith at all. Another question, why does God give us commandments? Is God a dictator? Is God just making us jump through hoops? Is he just like, playing games for his own benefit and his own amusement? Well, here's the law from the Old Testament. Do not put a garment of different kinds of wool and linen together. What? God's interested in fashion now. What's this about? There is an answer. The answer is the human body has a signature frequency of 100, and organic cotton is 100. Therefore, you don't want to wear a garment under 100. That is lower than the frequency of the human body. A sickly, near-dead person has a frequency of 15, and materials such as polyester, rayon, silk, and spandex register at 15. Science has proven that any fabric worn that has a frequency less than 100, our bodies puts a strain on us, which causes disease, inflammation, and other sicknesses. The only super fabrics are wool and linen, both measuring at 5,000, which energizes the bodies to help off disease. However, if you mix these two together, they create a negative charge. They cancel each other out. If you wear wool, it gives a positive charge, which if you're feeling ill, who here has slept like in a bed with like wool or linen sheets? It makes you feel good because of this science, because of the frequencies. But if you mix them together, it creates a negative charge which makes you feel physically ill. So God is giving a commandment here, which on the face of it is the most absurd, ridiculous, what on earth are you doing commandment, but he's doing it because he doesn't want us to feel ill. He can't really explain to the ancient Israelites, okay, listen up, your bodies are vibrating at a frequency of 100. Now you see that's got a frequency of this. But he can say, look, just don't do it. No, don't. It's only modern science which has discovered this. See, God, if the evidence which we've seen from science and what the Bible describes is correct, God is an eternal being. He's all-powerful. Can anything you do hurt God? Can anything you do help God? He's an infinite being. If you sing praises to God, it doesn't help his ego, but it helps you. If God gives a commandment, as with the motive for why create the universe, it's an act of love. He gives you a commandment the same way a parent gives a commandment to their children. He loves you. He doesn't want you to get hurt. Now, I said last week that I became an atheist when I was in high school. When I went to university, that's where I really became an atheist. And I said there's one thing which made me become an atheist, and it was this question. When I was in high school, someone said to me, "Are you a Christian?" I was like, "Yeah." "Why?" I was like, well, yeah. Which I thought at the time was a great answer. But then they said, "Okay, well, why did bad things happen to good people?" Yeah. I had no answer. I couldn't explain that. Has anyone here seen the Bible Project videos? Their YouTube channel, they do short videos which are based on the Bible. They do a really good series on what's known as the books of wisdom. So Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job. And it addresses these issues. I mean, some people think, okay, if I believe in God, if I believe in Jesus, everything's going to be fine. I'm not going to have any hardship because I'm doing the right thing. Well, Proverbs does have passages which seem to suggest that. It says, like, if you do the right thing, things will tend to go okay with you. But then you get to Ecclesiastes and it says, no. Sometimes good things happen to bad people. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. It's just random chance. There's no system to it. And then you get to the book of Job, where you've got a completely righteous man who suddenly all this stuff happens to, this awful suffering, and most of the book of Job is him and his friends and this dialogue of, like, this is why you're having this suffering, and, like, talking it through. It's the emotional turmoil of Job. If we're never going to have suffering in our lives, what is a book like Job doing in the Bible? If we're never going to feel conflict, we're never going to have hardship as a Christian, then what are half of the Proverbs about? And half of the Psalms. I mean, you read the Psalms. It's not, believe in God, and everything was hunky-dory after that. I never had a single problem. Great. A lot of the Psalms are this struggling. Does anyone know what the word Israel means? Because all Hebrew words have meaning. Israel means wrestled with God. The chosen people in the Bible are the ones who wrestle with God. These are things we're going to question. These are things, but we live in a fallen world. So we are going to have these type of things happen to us. And the Bible does explore that. So, but why would God create people who he knew would sin? If sin's so bad, why would God create people who would sin? I'm going to try and answer that question with a question. Why do parents have children who they know would sin? Love. You're going to have children, you know they're going to sin. I've got Samuel. He's very good most of the time. When he's bad, it's only because he's teething or something like that, but I know at some point he's going to sin. So, am I ever going to give up on Samuel? No, because I love him. Same way with God. But why would a loving God send people to hell? I mean, if someone commits a sin in life, which is only a short period of time, why would God, a loving God, have an eternal punishment for that? For some people that doesn't make sense. But God's a just God. Now, if I was to run over a dog on the way home tonight, which I'm not planning on, I would be punished. Rightly so. If I ran over a child, would my punishment be the same as running over that dog? It would be worse, because the dog has more value. The child has more value than the dog. I got that wrong. So, about an eternal, infinite being. What if you did something against that eternal, infinite being? Would the punishment be more severe? But ultimately, God is too loving to force someone into his presence against their will. Now, this is a question for the ladies. Ladies, have you ever had a man sue you who you weren't? I was laughing because he sat next to her. Have you ever had like the guy try and try and try, and then you say the famous words, look, I like you as a friend. I mean, what are you doing, ladies? Get a flamethrower, it'd be less painful. But what if the man then said, no, I love you so much, I'm going to force you to marry me. I'm going to take you, I'm going to put you in my house, I'm going to lock the door, you are going to love me because I love you and you've got to love me exactly the same way. Is that loving? Or, if the man loved you, would he let you go? See, there's people who do not want to be in God's presence. They hate God. They hate the idea of God. So would a loving God force them into his presence? I mean, heaven and hell, it's basically an eternity. If you've got two choices here. You've got an eternity, if this is all true, that you've got an eternity with God or an eternity without God. Those are your two options. So, but if you're without God, you're without everything good from God. I mean, God says he makes the sun shine on the good and the right and the unrighteous at the same time. Everyone here has experience of God's goodness. But if you want to be separate from God, he will not force you into his presence against your will. It's an act of love. Here's one. Why didn't God answer my prayer? We hear about if you have faith size of like a mustard seed, you can move mountains, yet you've had a prayer and it's not been answered. And sometimes you've really prayed and you've really wanted something and God didn't answer the prayer. Why wouldn't God answer your prayer? Well, I know someone else who didn't have a prayer answered. Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus prayed, if it was possible, don't let this cup pass over me. What would have been the consequences if God had answered that prayer? As Christians, we know that in this instance, there is a reason, and a very good reason, God didn't answer that prayer. Because if he'd answered it, the suffering and turmoil it would have created would be insurmountable. Okay, but what about religious wars? Okay, there's a lot of wars done in the name of religion. Surely that proves religion's evil. This is a source encyclopedia of wars. Here are the wars caused by governments. Here are all the wars caused by religion. And that one there is just the ones caused by... So the blue is Islamic wars, the red's non-Islamic wars. Because I had someone in my old job say, every single war is caused by religion. And I was like, World War I? Is that what? I said, World War I? What was the religion? Well, no, that wasn't caused by religion. Okay, World War II. Well, no, that wasn't caused by religion. Ah, the Falklands War. Well, no. It's like, oh, okay. War in Iraq. Both of them. Again. But even so, that number is too high. That is bad. But it does go on to our next question. Isn't the church full of hypocrites? A lot of people look at people who go to church and say, well, you know, you don't practice what you preach. The church is full of hypocrites. To which the answer is, yes, and there's room for one more. Of course, we're fallen people. We're not perfect. We go to church. Does that make us perfect? No. The church is a hospital. You don't go to a hospital if you're well. You come to a hospital if you're sick. We're all fallen creatures. We all need God. But as William Wilberforce said, what a difference it would be if our system of morality were based on the Bible instead of the standards devised by cultural Christians. But here's another question which again goes into the question of evil and suffering. If Jesus, as Christians believe, is God, why is God on a cross? Why is God going through that? It comes to the solution to the problem of evil. Richard Dawkins, who said, you know, the God of the Old Testament was evil, said, the universe that we observe has properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, just blind, pitiless indifference. God's evil, but there's no such thing as evil. See, this is the thing with atheism. There is no standard for morality. There's no objective standard. So Richard Dawkins has to say that because that's where the atheist worldview leads. See, on the atheist worldview, we have a universe which came by chance, where life has no purpose, we have no free will, evil doesn't exist, and there is no hope. If a natural disaster happens, if a child dies, so what? To put it bluntly, it's just molecules. It's just particles over each, involved, meaningless. All you get is you're born, you die, bit of space in between, but ultimately everything we do is pointless because the whole universe is going to collapse anyway. So, it's a problem of evil. Atheism, there is no answer. We all feel that there's evil. We've all experienced suffering. What's the solution? There is none. But the evidence which we've been looking at the last 2 weeks points somewhere else. It points to a universe which is designed for life. That means that life has a purpose. We have free will. Evil does exist, and it is a problem. But there is hope. What is the solution to the problem of evil? The cross and resurrection. Why is God on a cross? Why? See, this is not like the totalitarian God which Christopher Hitchens talks about, one who is malevolent like a puppet master giving us hoops to jump through. This is a God who there is evil and suffering. He comes down and takes part in it. He suffers in ways we can't imagine. A few weeks' time, I'm going to be talking about the evidence of the resurrection, and I am going to talk about what happens at crucifixion. It's not going to be easy to listen to, but it's important to understand the level of suffering which God put himself through. And why did he put himself through it? Was it for himself? No, it's for us. Ones who turned their backs on him, ones who went their own way. I mean, that's what sin is. It's turning your back on God and going your own way. God answers the problem. Frank Turek says, so evil can't exist unless good exists, but good can't exist unless God exists. In other words, there can be no objective evil unless there is objective good, and there can be no objective good unless God exists. If evil is real, and we all know it is, then God exists. Masobra said, if God would concede me his omnipotence for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make to the world. But if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things as they are. See, that answers the question before of like, can God do anything about evil or not? God has this wisdom. Wisdom which sees beyond what we can see. In any situation, we know that there's a loving God, that he has done things out of love for us. So therefore, we know that all things work to God's good. So, we've got objective evil. How do we explain it? As Richard Dawkins says, you cannot explain it by staying within the confines of the natural world. But if there's a transcendent, objective standard of goodness by which evil is contrasted, which is external, then we can explain evil. So it changes our suspect profile. We can add some things to it now. So the cause of the universe, what explains this evidence, has to be external to the universe, non-spatial, atemporal, non-material, uncaused, powerful enough to create everything we see in the universe, specifically purposeful enough to produce a universe fine-tuned for life, intelligent, creative and resourceful, a conscious mind, free to choose and create personally, personal source of all moral truth and obligation, and the standard for good by which we define evil. What does that sound like? If you were to put a name to those aspects, if someone said, what am I talking about, and you listed that, they would say God. So again, like our crime scene, where we have to get the pointer to work. There we go. We have like evidence which points outside the room. Again, we've seen, if all this evidence points to one single person, then we know that person's our suspect. We have all of these things now pointing in the same direction, and that direction matches the God of the Bible. All of these different things, it all points in that one direction. Now, we looked at some of the alternative explanations, but as you can see here, for every single bit of evidence, there's multiple explanations, and guess what? None of them agree with each other. Whereas here, every single bit of evidence can be explained by one thing, and that is God. But there's another bit of evidence. Personal relationship. Because the God of the Bible is not a God of facts, figures, mathematics. He is, but it's a God with which you can have a personal experience. As William Lane Craig says, if you're sincerely seeking God, God will make his existence evident. This is a God with who you can know. But I've talked a lot about suffering and a lot about evil, and I know it's a tough subject, so I want to leave you with some good things. So Romans 5:3-4, suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Psalms 147:3, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Romans 8:18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory which will be revealed in us. Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for the good of them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. There's a woman called Annie Johnson Flint. She was a woman who was born in the 1800s, and she suffered many diseases. She was confined to a wheelchair, she lost all movement, and she had terrible bed sores, and she lived in constant pain. But she wrote this: He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labours increase. To added afflictions he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we had exhausted our stores of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. Fear not that your need shall exceed his provision. Our God ever yearns his resources to share. Lean hard on the arm everlasting, availing. The Father both you and your load will upbear. His love has no limits, his grace no measure, his power no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. Spoken by someone who experienced suffering every single day, who had more knowledge than most of us will know, and a greater understanding, I think we can see from that. But can God answer prayer? Is there a God who can intervene in the world? Do we have a God which wound the universe up like a tin soldier and let it go on? Or is there a God who can enter time and space, who can affect people personally and has acted in history? That's what the Bible says, that God can do these things. Is there any evidence for that? You'll find out next week. Leave them wanting more.